family couldn't pay for my studies, so I worked in everything until I made my dreams come true. I grew up in a large family, one of those where gatherings are chaotic but full of laughter. However, there was a very clear line that divided the family. My uncles were more well off, while my parents struggled every day to put food on the table. My dad worked as a mechanic and my mom cleaned houses. I was always taught that hard work was everything, but as I grew up, I realized that effort was not always enough. Since I was a child, I dreamed of studying something big, of being someone important. I watched my older cousins get into college, their parents buy them new computers and help them move into apartments near their campuses. I, on the other hand, couldn't even ask for an extra book at school because I knew it would be a burden. Despite that, I was always at the top of my class, getting good grades, earning small scholarships that covered basic things like uniform. My teachers always told me I had a bright future, but that only added more weight to my shoulders. By the time I finished high school, I knew college wasn't an option. The money just wasn't there, and even though my parents cried on my graduation day, they made it clear to me that they couldn't do more. So instead of crying about what I didn't have, I made a decision. I was going to work, save, and pay for my own education, no matter how long it took. My first job was at a grocery store, carrying boxes from 5 in the morning until noon. I would rush off to my second job as a helper at a mechanic's shop, where I learned to disassemble and repair engines. At night, I washed dishes at a local restaurant. At first, my friends made fun of me, saying I would never get out of the hole I was born into. My cousins, on the other hand, barely noticed me. They were too busy posting photos of their travels, concert outings, and new cell phones on social media. The routine was exhausting, but something in me wouldn't let me give up. There were days when I came home so tired I could barely eat before collapsing into bed. My hands were covered in calluses and cuts, and my back hurt like I was twice my age. But every penny I earned, I saved. I didn't go out with friends, I didn't spend money on new clothes, I didn't do anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. During those years, I learned much more than in any classroom. I learned the value of sacrifice, discipline, and above all, not to depend on anyone else to achieve my goals. I also discovered how cruel the world can be. There were days when I wasn't paid what I was promised, clients who took advantage of my neediness, and coworkers who tried to drag me down just to get better hours or tips. My family, though proud of my work ethic, began to worry. My mom told me I worked too much, that I should find time to live, but how could I think about that when all I wanted was to secure a better future? One day, while I was bussing tables at a restaurant, I overheard two customers talking about investments. I didn't understand much, but I was intrigued. That night, instead of sleeping, I started researching how the stock market worked. It was like a whole new world had opened up before my eyes. I decided to risk a small portion of my savings on shares of a company I had just read about on a forum. That first investment didn't make me rich, but it taught me something important. There were ways to make money work for me. Every night after work, I spent hours watching videos, reading books, and learning about finance. Things started to change when I turned 25. I had saved enough to open a small business in my town, an appliance repair shop. At first, I worked alone, serving customers during the day and repairing things late into the night. It wasn't easy, but the business slowly grew. It wasn't long before my cousins began to notice my success. Some congratulated me, but I could sense the envy in their words. Others simply ignored me, as if my success reminded them of something they'd rather not admit. My parents, on the other hand, couldn't be prouder. Seeing the smile on their faces was the greatest achievement of my life, at least up until that point. But it wasn't all happiness. As my business grew, so did the workload and stress. My savings grew, but my days were still just as long and tiring. I felt trapped in an endless cycle. The shop was going well, but it was consuming me. My personal life was a mess because I had no time for anything but work. My childhood friends didn't even write to me anymore. My cousins were still living comfortably, with their college degrees framed on the walls, but none of them seemed really happy. I, on the other hand, had money but no peace. It was at that time that I made my first big mistake. A client offered me a partnership to expand the business. He promised to double the profits in less than a year. His enthusiasm convinced me, and I put almost everything I had into that investment. For the first few months, things seemed to be going well, until one day he simply disappeared, taking everything with him. I was left with debt and a workshop on the verge of bankruptcy. That blow nearly destroyed me. I remember sitting in the empty workshop one night, with the lights off, thinking about everything I had sacrificed to get here. My hands shook as I held my phone, staring at my empty bank account. I thought about my parents, who had always believed in me, and I felt like the biggest failure in the world. But something inside me refused to give up. It was as if all the times I had been underestimated, all the times I had been told I wasn't enough, had lit a spark that refused to go out. I stood up, took a deep breath, and decided I wasn't going to let that defeat define my life. I sold what little I had left left to pay off my debts and started over, this time with a small fast food stand. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest and had a good profit margin. During the day, I cooked and waited on customers, and at night, I continued reading about finance and investing. It was at that point that I began to see the fruits of years of learning. My investments began to give me small profits, enough to reinvest. Little by little, very carefully, I began to build a diversified portfolio. Every dollar I earned, I multiplied with patience and strategy. Life was still hard. My cousins, who once made fun of my efforts, began asking me for money. Some made excuses, saying they were going through hard time. At first, I helped because I couldn't forget they were family, but I soon realized I was nothing more than a boss. While I worked tirelessly, they spent recklessly, trusting that I would always be there to bail them out. One night, as I was returning home after closing up shop, I found my dad sitting in the living room. He was crying, something I had never seen in my life. He told me that one of my cousins had insulted my mom because she wouldn't lend him money. It was like something inside me exploded. That very night, I decided to cut off all contact with them. Over time, my business grew. From a small fast food stand, I moved on to opening a chain of restaurants. My investment portfolio also grew exponentially, and one day I realized that I no longer had to worry about money. I was free. I remember the day I took my parents to their new house, one I bought especially for them. My dad couldn't stop looking at the garden, while my mom cried with happiness. It was the first time I felt truly successful. But life, as always, never stops testing me. Just when I felt like things were starting to stabilize, I got a call from my mom. She told me that my dad wasn't feeling well. Her voice, normally strong and determined, sounded shaky. I dropped everything I was doing and rushed to the hospital. When I arrived, I saw him in a hospital bed, more fragile than I had ever seen him. It was as if the weight of years had suddenly caught up with him. The doctors gave us the news. He had advanced heart disease. The treatment was expensive, but thanks to what I had built with so much effort, I was able to cover every expense without hesitation. But that didn't make the pain any less intense. I watched him struggle every day, trying to stay strong for us, while I remembered all the times I had gotten up early to work beside him in the field. My dad was my rock, my role model, and now I saw him crumble before my eyes. During those days, I also faced a betrayal I had not expected. My older cousin, the one who had always treated me as if I was worthless, appeared in my office. I hadn't heard from him for years, but there he was, dressed in expensive clothes, but with a face that showed desperation. He asked me for money to save his company, which was on the verge of bankruptcy. I couldn't help but feel a mixture of anger and pity. For the first time in my life, I said no to him. I didn't do it out of hatred, but with the certainty that I couldn't continue to bear the mistakes of others. He left, insulting me, saying that he would never have gotten to where he was if it weren't for the help of our family. But I knew that those words were nothing more than a reflection of his own failure. Meanwhile, my dad continued to fight. There were days when I thought we would lose him, but he clung to life with a strength that inspired me. In one of our conversations, he took me by the hand and said something I will never forget. "Son, I am proud of you. You have done more than I ever dreamed possible. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve it." Those words gave me a new perspective. I started spending more time with my family, enjoying the little moments with them. I realized that while money was important, it wasn't the only thing that defined my success. It was love, gratitude, and the ability to give back to the world that really mattered. Time passed, and my dad recovered enough to return home. I took him to the field where we worked when I was a child, and we spent the day reminiscing about old times. It was a peaceful moment, a reminder of how far we had come together. Despite my father's partial recovery, things were not as easy as I had hoped. His health improved, yes, but he was not the same strong man I had once known. Seeing him like this, so fragile, was like a constant reminder that time is unforgiving. There were nights when I stayed awake by his bedside just to listen to his breathing. Every sigh of his was a relief, a sign that I still had him with me. But the emotional burden of those moments was devastating. Meanwhile, my relationship with my cousin continued to deteriorate. His company's debt had not only affected his financial life, but had also brought to light the resentment he had long harbored toward me. One day, he showed up at my house with papers in hand. It was a desperate attempt to obtain something he believed was rightfully his, my parents' inheritance. The tone of the conversation quickly turned sour. He accused me of being selfish, of forgetting about family, of using my success as a weapon against others. But what hurt me most were not his words, but the presence of my aunt, his mother, who stood beside him and supported him. That same aunt who had been like a second mother to me in my childhood was now standing there, looking looking at me with contempt. The argument ended with legal threats from him and a promise from me not to give up a single cent. I closed the door with a broken heart, knowing that this fight went beyond money. It was a rift in our family that might never heal. As if that wasn't enough, the business I had worked so hard to build also began to face difficulty. The economy was in crisis, and my biggest contracts began to be canceled one after another. The nights I once spent dreaming about the future were now filled with financial calculations and desperate plans to stay afloat. There were days when I felt like all my efforts had been in vain, that the whole world was determined to bring me down. But in those moments, I clung to the image of my father working under the sun, to my mother's words telling me that I was the family's hope, and to the promises I had made to myself as a teenager carrying sacks of rice in the market. It was in the midst of that storm that something unexpected happened. A childhood friend, someone I hadn't seen in years, sought me out to offer me an opportunity. He had heard about my situation and wanted to partner with me on a project that he believed had the potential to change our lives. It was risky, but I decided to accept. The following weeks were a roller coaster of emotion. We worked day and night, facing obstacles that seemed insurmountable. But little by little, things began to improve. The first profits arrived, and with them, renewed hope. However, just when I thought fate was giving me a break, I received another call that took my breath away. My father had had a relapse. The call paralyzed me. It was my mother, her voice cracking, barely able to get the words out. My father had been rushed to the hospital. I dropped everything I was doing and rushed to the hospital. When I arrived, I found him hooked up to machines monitoring his breathing and heart. His face, which had always been my source of strength, seemed lost among wires and tubes. I sat down beside him and took his hand. It was cold, but I still had a light grip. At that moment, I felt a guilt that cut through me like a knife. Had I spent too much time obsessing over success and work, neglecting the people who really mattered? I thought of all the times I had put off a visit or a call to stay longer at the office. Now, in front of that hospital bed, all those excuses seemed insignificant. That night was long. The doctor gave us little hope, and my mother, who had always been the strongest, broke down in tears in my arm. It was the first time I saw her so vulnerable, and that image stuck in my mind. But I couldn't let despair get the better of me. If I had learned anything from my father, it was to fight even when all seemed lost. I decided to take a break from business to devote myself fully to my family. However, this was not well received by everyone. My partner, who until then had been a pillar of support, began to question my commitment to the project. Our relationship became strained, and on more than one occasion we had heated arguments. He did not understand my need to prioritize my father, and I could not understand how anyone could be so insensitive. The pressure was overwhelming. I was trying to be everywhere, at the hospital with my father, at home comforting my mother, and at the office trying to save the business. But my body started to take its toll. I lost weight, barely slept, and began to suffer constant headache. It got to the point where I felt like I couldn't take it anymore. That's when I received an unexpected text. It was my cousin, the same one who had threatened me with lawsuit. In the text, he told me that he had heard about my father's condition and wanted to talk. I hesitated to respond, but something inside me told me I should. We met at a cafe, and to my surprise, his attitude had changed. He was no longer the arrogant and resentful man I remembered. He told me that his company had completely collapsed and that he was now bankrupt. For the first time in a long time, he seemed genuinely remorseful. He apologized for all the harm he had caused me, and although it was hard for me, I decided to forgive him. Not because he deserved it, but because I needed to let go of that weight I had been carrying for years. However, things did not end there. Days later, while I was in the hospital, the doctor gave us the news that my father needed urgent and expensive surgery to have a chance of survival. The problem was that my savings were almost exhausted by previous medical expenses and investment in the business. I found myself in a dilemma that seemed to have no way out. That's when my cousin showed up again, this time with an offer that left me speechless. My cousin came up with a proposal that left me frozen. He wanted to sell me the few properties he still had, but not as a simple transaction. He wanted me to keep everything in exchange for something much more valuable, my help in saving his reputation and giving him a second chance in business. For a moment, I felt as if life was putting me at an impossible crossroad. I was torn between the resentment I still carried and the possibility of doing the right thing, even if it meant working alongside someone who had tried to destroy me. Meanwhile, my mother, with tears in her eyes, begged me not to let pride cloud my judgment. My father was still in the hospital, and every day that passed without surgery diminished his chances of survival. I accepted the offer, but not without condition. I made it clear that this was his last chance, and that if he failed or tried to play me dirty again, there would be no going back. With that agreement, I sold everything I could: my car, some of the furniture in the house, and even the tools I had used for years to build my business from scratch, all to raise the money my father needed. The day of surgery was one of the longest days of my life. We waited in the operating room for hours, my mother praying quietly and me staring at the floor, trying to find some hope in the midst of all the chaos. Finally, the doctor came out with a faint smile and told us that the operation had been a success, but that the road to recovery would be long and difficult. During those months, I devoted myself entirely to caring for my father and rebuilding my life from scratch. My cousin, surprisingly, kept his word. He worked day and night to build a new business under my supervision, and although the relationship was strained at first, little by little we began to recover something resembling a friendship. But it wasn't all that simple. One night, while I was reviewing the accounts for the new business, I discovered that someone was embezzling funds. My heart stopped. All signs pointed to my cousin. I felt a mixture of anger and disappointment so deep that I could barely breathe. I confronted him the next day, and what he confessed to me left me speechless. It wasn't him who was stealing. It was his wife. She, desperate to maintain a lifestyle they could no longer afford, had been transferring money without his knowledge. My cousin, ashamed and devastated, begged me not to report him. I decided to give him another chance, but this time under even stricter terms. Over time, things began to improve. My father regained his health, albeit in a more fragile state, and became the wise and strong man he had always been. My mother, though scarred by all we had been through, found comfort in the unity of our family. However, life had one last lesson in store for me. One afternoon, while I was working on the business accounts, I received a call from an unknown number. I answered absent-mindedly, but what I heard on the other end of the line shocked me. It was my cousin's family lawyer. He told me that there was some paperwork he needed to review urgently, and that it was related to my parents' estate. My mind began to race, reliving years of conflict and pain. I headed to the law office, my heart pounding so loud I could feel it in my ears. Upon arrival, I was presented with a sealed envelope. It was a copy of a will my grandfather had left years before, a document that no one, not even my father, knew existed. In it, my grandfather detailed that half of all his property was to be divided between my father and me, as he saw in me the determination that others in the family had squandered. The problem was that these properties no longer existed in their entirety. Most of them had been sold or mortgaged by my cousin and his family over the years, under the excuse of keeping the family afloat. Legally, the situation was a mess, but there was a small chance of recovering some of what was lost if he took the case to court. The thought of facing them again made me sick. I had tried so many times to move away from resentment, to build something from scratch without depending on anyone, but this time it wasn't just about me. It was my father, who had worked all his life for nothing in return, and my mother, who had sacrificed tirelessly. I decided to fight. The legal process was grueling. There were lies, false witnesses, and personal attacks that made me question whether it was worth it. My cousin, now trying to save his own skin, tried to convince me to settle out of court. He told me that dragging this out would only destroy the few family relationships that remained, but I knew this wasn't about reconciliation. It was about justice. One day before doomsday, I found a forgotten box in the attic of my parents' house. It contained old letters from my grandfather, writings where he talked about the dreams he had for me and our family. There was one in particular that broke my heart. Sometimes the sacrifices of one generation are the hope for the next. I hope you find the strength to be that hope. Those words gave me the courage I needed. The trial was a spectacle of emotions and revelation. Hidden documents, bank accounts that didn't add up, and testimonies that laid bare years of lies. When the judge finally gave his verdict, I couldn't hold back my tears. The return of a significant portion of the property was ordered, enough to ensure the stability of my family and to start projects that for years had been only dreams. That night, sitting with my parents in our old house, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. My mother, her eyes filled with tears, said to me, "I always knew you had something special, not just for what you accomplished, but for how you never let resentment define you." Although the victory was sweet, it was also bittersweet. My cousin and his family were in ruin, and although part of me wanted to continue helping them, I knew it was no longer my responsibility. Sometimes, letting go is not an act of abandonment, but of self-love. Life went on. With the properties reclaimed, my father returned to planting on the land he once thought was lost forever. My mother, always the backbone of our family, found solace in tending a small garden she had started as a hobby. I, for my part, dedicated myself to expanding the business I had started from scratch, helping other young people who, like me, just needed a chance to show what they were made of. Over time, I came to understand that true wealth was not in what I had recovered, but in the lessons I learned in the process. Sometimes, the darkest moments of our lives are the ones that lead us to discover our true light. And in the end, it doesn't matter how many times you fall. What really matters is that you always find the strength to get up. Although I thought the battle was over, I soon discovered that life always has more chapters, even when you think you've reached the end of a book. Reclaiming the land and stabilizing my family's economic situation was just the first step in a much deeper transformation, one that led me to confront not only my circumstances, but also the emotional wounds I had been carrying around for years. My cousin, after the trial, disappeared from our lives completely. There was no apology, no attempt at reconciliation. It was as if he had decided to erase our existence so as not to face the guilt. Although I was relieved not to have to deal with his antics, a part of me regretted what our family had become, a collection of broken pieces that no longer fit together. My mother told me not to carry that weight, but the emptiness was still there, like a persistent echo. Over time, I decided that I wanted to do something meaningful with the reclaimed land. My grandfather had always dreamed that our family would not only survive, but also thrive. So I turned part of the property into a community center for low-income youth. We offered vocational training, basic education, and spaces where they could dream without limits. Seeing these boys and girls full of hope reminded me of myself, of the days when all I had was the determination not to give up. But just when things seemed to be going well, life threw me another unexpected blow. My father started getting sick. At first, they were minor ailments that he dismissed as just old age. But it wasn't long before they became more frequent and severe. After weeks of insistence, we managed to convince him to go to the doctor. The diagnosis was devastating: advanced cancer. It was as if the world had stopped. My father, the strongest man I knew, the one who had endured humiliation and sacrifice without breaking, now faced a battle he could not fight with willpower. For months, our family threw itself completely into his care. The nights were long and filled with uncertainty, and the days were marked by doctor's appointments, treatments, and moments of hope that alternated with an unrelenting reality. On one such night, while we were alone, my father took my hand and told me something I will never forget. "Son, I always thought my greatest failure was failing to protect what was ours, but you showed me that the true wealth of a family is not in what they have, but in who they are. I am proud of you, more than you could ever imagine." His passing left a huge void, but he also left me with a legacy that I felt a responsibility to honor. After his funeral, I realized that I had to keep moving forward, not just for him, but for myself and for the people I had decided to help. The community center grew bigger than I ever imagined. Local businesses began donating resources, and former participants came back as volunteers, wanting to give back what they once received. What started as a small dream had now become a movement that impacted hundreds of lives. My mother, though devastated by the loss of my father, found solace in being an active part of the project. She became a mother figure to many of the young people who came looking for a place to feel valued. Her strength and unconditional love were at the heart of everything we did. One day, while walking downtown, I saw a young man sitting alone in a corner. He looked so much like me when I was younger that I immediately stopped. I walked over and we started talking. His story mirrored my own: poverty, hopelessness, and a burning desire to change his fate. At that moment, I understood something my grandfather always tried to teach me. Life is not just about what you achieve for yourself, but what you leave behind for others. Today, as I write this, I am sitting in the same house where it all began. The walls are filled with photos and memories of good and bad times that together make up my family's story. I can't say that life has been easy, but I can say with certainty that each obstacle made me stronger, more grateful, and more determined to be the best version of myself. The journey doesn't end here. Life continues to surprise me, challenge me, and teach me. But if there's one thing I know for sure, it's that as long as I have the ability to fight, to love, and to dream, there will always be a new chapter to write. One day, while I was supervising the activities of the community center, my attention was drawn to a group of young people who were gathered together, laughing and sharing ideas. Among them was a boy who reminded me of myself years ago. His look had changed. He no longer had that weight of hopelessness that I had seen the first time. He approached me with a notebook in his hand and a smile that made me feel a strange knot in my chest. "I want to show you something," he said. He opened his notebook and I saw drawings, plans, and a dream written on paper. He wanted to build something of his own, a technical school for young people in his community. "It's thanks to you that I can dream about this," he added, his eyes filled with emotion. At that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't pride or satisfaction. It was a deep connection to the purpose that had kept me standing all this time. I wasn't just changing my life, I was changing lives through what I had learned, suffered, and accomplished. Coming home that night, I sat on the porch, looking up at the stars. I closed my eyes and thought of my father, my grandfather, all the people who had been with me and, in some way, shaped me. I thought of my cousin, whose absence was a reminder that we can't always save everyone. I thought of my mother's sacrifice, of the days of hunger, of the tears, of the failures that seemed insurmountable. All of that, all the pain, the sacrifices, and the struggles had brought me here. In the midst of these thoughts, my mother joined me on the porch. "Your father would be so proud," she said quietly, also looking up at the stars. "You did more than take back what was taken from us. You did something that no one can take from you. You changed lives." My mother's words struck me with an overwhelming truth. The wealth I had accumulated, the accomplishments, even the tangible impact of the community center were not my true legacy. My legacy was the hope I had kindled in others, the promise that no matter how dark the night, there is always a way to find the light. That night, under the stars, I promised that I would never stop fighting, not for myself, but for all those who still believe that their dreams are impossible. Because if there is one thing I have learned from my life, it is that dreams cannot be bought with money or privileges. Dreams are built with determination, with sacrifices, and with the courage to get up again and again, even when the world seems determined to tear you down. And so, I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to imagine the future, one where my mistakes, my achievements, and my story would be the spark that would light the way for others. Because at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is what we leave in the hearts of those around us.